Hi, I'm Blake Gray, and I'm here with Adam Lee. He is the founding winemaker at Siduri, a Pinot Noir specialist in California, and also the owner winemaker of Clarice Wine Company. And we're going to talk today about a subject that is near and dear to a wine geek's heart, which is fermentation vessels. Because Adam just released this wine called Root and Rebel, and one of the big concepts behind it is that this is fermented and aged in concrete. And you know, concrete, I feel like I have an affinity for wines aged in concrete, but this is a fermentation technique from 100 years ago that people completely stopped doing for a while, and now they're back in it's kind of back in vogue. So Adam, why don't you tell me, why did you decide to do this Pinot Noir in concrete?
Sure. Good morning, Blake. It's good to see you. The concrete thing came about on a trip I did 2 years ago where, actually 2.5 years ago, I went to Chateauneuf-du-Pape with Mike Officer from Carlisle Winery. And we just decided to go as kind of a fun visit. We went to the 15 vintage, 16 vintage, and actually the 17 vintage were all pretty fantastic years there. So we thought it would be fun to take a little trip and visit some producers and see the area. And so we were going around place to place, and we came across a number of places that really, well, first off, they would always call Grenache the Pinot Noir of Chateauneuf-du-Pape. Of all the 13 red grape types, it's the one that they say most resembled Pinot Noir. Now, it was different than Pinot in two ways, though. It got riper than Pinot Noir. By Pinot, they were talking Burgundy specifically. So it got riper, and it had more tannin than Pinot Noir did. The other thing I noticed was that they were aging in many places, not just fermenting, but aging the Pinot Noir in concrete. Now the Syrah, the Grenache, the Mourvedre, the Counoise, those other things had oak aging to them. But the Grenache part was in concrete. Well, it made me think, if they're calling this Pinot Noir, the Pinot Noir of Chateauneuf-du-Pape, if they're making comparisons, and they're saying, well, it gets riper than they do in Burgundy, that's true. But in California, we tend to get plenty ripe, or we can, as far as Pinot goes, if we choose to do so. And we do have certain clones of Pinot Noir that have thick skins. Not as many as, because they're not really favored by Pinot Noir winemakers. People don't like them that much. But notably, 828 clone, which was something that was snuck over by Gary Andrus at Archery Summit some years ago, and isn't the true 828 clone. It's an upright growing clone. So it's actually a selection, not a clone. So it's 828, then Martini and 23 are all clones that aren't necessarily loved by Pinot Noir winemakers because of those very thick skins. Well, it got me to thinking, those then resemble more what they are doing with Grenache and concrete and Chateauneuf. So let me see if I can replicate what they're doing with, but doing it in a Pinot Noir world, and maybe taking these Pinot clones that are in disfavor and finding a way to use them in a positive way. So that was kind of the genesis behind it.
Interesting. Now, what are you looking for? What kind of characteristic in the wine are you looking for when you're using concrete?
Well, so this was my first time to ferment, and certainly first time to age in concrete. So to some extent, I mean, the wine that you've got there was an experiment in many cases for me. So what I was trying to do was figuring that with no oak, you know, with oak, you get a certain amount of tannin extraction from the barrels. With no tannin extraction, you are going to need to get more tannin out of it in the fermenter before and get it more time on the skins, or pull more tannins out of the skins. So what I was trying to do here was, with those thicker skin clones, I pumped over instead of punched down, which will get you better coverage and certainly extract more in the way of tannins from the wine, and try to give it a bit more backbone. In all honesty, the wine you're trying, the 18, while I like it quite a bit, I think in 19, I did a much better job. Figured out that I didn't even go far enough in 18. You know, very rarely the first time that we all do something, do you hit it out of the park right off the bat. And so the 19 vintage, I think, came much, much closer to what I was looking for in doing that. But by 19 vintage, I ended up doing 48 days on the skins. So a long period of time, really in California, we got so scared of tannin in Pinot Noir. We got so scared of backbone. We made wines that were very lush, very immediate, but didn't quite have that weight and tannin to them that I really was looking for in this particular wine. So I think this wine turned out really good, but I think the 19 has more of what I was looking for. And what I'm looking for is to try to make up for some of the things that you don't get, or that you get from oak, some of the positive attributes, some of the tannins, try to make up for those without some of the vanilla character and other flavors in the wine, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, so this is why I like things that are fermented in concrete, because I have that sense that I'm tasting the grape as opposed to, honestly, probably the only variety that I really like oak in is Chardonnay.
Sure.
It's a terrific combination. But it excites me to be able to taste more of the grape. So compare for me the amount of time that you put this Pinot on the skins as opposed to how long it would spend on the skins in oak and then some other fermentation vessels you might have.
Sure. So normal time for Pinot Noir, and this is not just true for me, but for most Pinot winemakers that I know, and obviously that's a broad statement, but just kind of down the middle of the road, is around 17 days, 14 to 21 day time period. Just call it 17, cut it down the middle. So a little over 2.5 weeks is the fermentation time. Usually about 4 or 5 of those days are cold soak, letting the fermentation get started. The remaining 10 or 12 days, 14 days are the fermentation completing. Then you press it off when fermentation is done. Here, on that particular wine was 28 days, the one that you have there. So it was not quite double the norm, but certainly a good bit more, 60, 70% more than the norm. Once I'm getting up to that 48-day period that I did with the 19 vintage, you're almost 3 times the normal time on the skins that you would get.
Now, let me ask you what might be a stupid question. How do you keep it? You're talking about fermenting on the skins. How do you keep the fermentation going for that many days?
Yeah. So you don't that long. At the end, the cap starts to fall, and so fermentation comes to an end. So what you end up doing at that point in time is you will still pump it over, but you pump it over and pump it into the must. So to push the skins back up again so that they'll rise up. The concern you can have is that the wine can get on the top, it can dry out a good bit, and you can get higher levels of volatile acidity, other issues in the particular wine if you don't keep the top wet. So I'll pump over a little bit, but also by pushing the skins back up, it will keep that top refreshed and wet again, so you don't end up with that VA issue. But you also don't introduce oxygen as much, which was a challenge with concrete. And I will tell you this is something that I didn't expect and I didn't know with his first year. When you are fermenting in a big stainless steel tank, I mean, think about this. It's just a big opening, and there's a lot of air that gets in to the must and to as things are fermenting. When you're fermenting in a concrete tank, although it has a decent size opening, it's not a closed tank. It's not an egg type vessel. It doesn't have nearly as big an opening to it as it did before. So the wines that I made in concrete proved to be slightly reductive. And so it was something that finding a way to introduce a bit more oxygen into the fermentation was something that I had to work on that I didn't really anticipate that I was going to have to do.
That's interesting because I would think, so concrete has more gas permeability than steel. So that's interesting. I wouldn't expect that.
It does have much more gas permeability, and that's the reason I didn't suspect it either. I was right in the same boat you are. You and I would have made the same wine here, Blake.
Well, yours would be better. It would always be better.
I don't know about that, but the issue was, while it does have more gas permeability, you're correct, and you will actually notice the pH going up. Also in concrete tanks, you have the strength of the acidity is lessened somewhat. You don't have just that big opening in a stainless steel tank. I mean, it is truly, the tanks that I use are 4 to 6 feet and even 8 feet wide. Some of them, they're wider than they are tall. Yeah, they're open top tanks. So they're completely open there. You can put on, and you do put on sometimes a covering to make sure that you don't get gnats and stuff like that. But that's just a mesh covering that allows, it keeps out bugs, but that's all it really does in some ways. If you, on this tank, it's about a 3 foot opening.
Hmm.
And so that is a much less oxygen getting in that way.
Interesting. And so what did you do to get more oxygen into it?
So when doing that pump over process, I went through a sump, basically. So taking out of the bottom of the tank, going through a screen into a pan, which invoked a lot of oxygen. So just let it bleed out of there naturally by gravity, and then pumped out of that sump back around to the top.
Okay. Now let's talk about fermentation vessels in general, because you've always made a lot of wines in a vintage.
Yep.
And are you using, even before concrete, several different kinds of fermentation vessels?
So back in the early days of Siduri, when we were making very, very small quantities and didn't really have enough to go into a tank even, we used 1-ton plastic bins. And occasionally we used half-ton bins. And one year when I made a little bit of quinoa, I used a trash can.
Ah,
A plastic trash can. The problem you run into when you get to smaller and smaller vessels is really temperature to some extent. They do not warm up very much, which is okay if you want a long, cool fermentation. It can be challenging if you want that fermentation to finish sometimes. So as you get near the end, as the fermentation cools down, sometimes it decides that it's not just cooling down, it's stopping along the way too. And that can be a real challenge. So I remember in that trash can, we wrapped it with electric blankets. I mean, just so you're talking, you buy winemaking supplies sometimes at Macy's with electric blankets, and then you go over to the aquarium store, the fish store, and you put aquarium heaters into barrels if the fermentation doesn't finish, and you help them finish in the barrel with aquarium heaters.
wow. Technically, why are you doing that? What about the aquarium heater is helping the fermentation finish?
So fermentation to finish needs a certain temperature, and it needs to be in the 60s roundabout, low 60s can work. I mean, there are people that ferment Chardonnay and other things over a long period of time. I mean, you can find, I've read articles, maybe you were one of them have written about it because you've traveled the world over and seen people who make wine in many, many different ways. There are people that say, I've got a 9-month fermentation. Here, taste this. It's taken 9 months or even longer, more than a year. Some people have things like that. The problem with that is they probably have had more disasters, things that didn't work out as opposed to the one they're showing you that did work out. So what ends up happening is those long, long fermentations, a lot of times, sometimes they don't finish at all. And then you end up with a wine that's got a certain amount of residual sugar to it. And that's not necessarily what you want. There is a process called a restart process that you can go through to try to get that fermentation restarted again. It is difficult. It's a pain in the ass. And it is, I don't think, particularly good for the wine.
Mm. Yeah, no, you mentioned traveling around the world. When I first encountered concrete fermentation tanks, it would be in places like Eastern Europe, where they would have been installed during the Cold War. And they'd have these enormous concrete tanks. And they would all be saying, oh, well, now we've moved on to modern technology. And then it was in Bordeaux, actually, that I first discovered high-end wineries using these old concrete tanks. And the wines can be beautiful because they feel like they're more, it's more grape flavor.
Yeah, my first one was at Mayacamas, back when I was in wine retail many years ago. But again, an old winery, a winery that and yet they were making it work incredibly well, and it showed up in the quality of the wines was fantastic. So
now, how did you make the concrete tank? Buy it?
Yeah. So, well, that first one we bought it. So this is a venture that I'm doing with Jackson Family, and it's us working together on this. And I came back with this idea. I mean, this was a summertime trip, and sat down with Barbara and Rick and the folks at Jackson. And in very typical, particularly with Rick, who is very passionate, very strong, he's like, this is a fantastic idea. Let's go for it. Let's buy all the tanks you need. How many do you need? Well, you don't just have a tank made quickly for you. This is a long process. So I tried looking around. I mean, it was too late to get one for harvest, but I found a used one over in Napa, and we bought it and brought it over. So that first wine was one tank that we had made for us. Had to do a couple of retrofits, but it was pretty simple, pretty easy. Since then, we bought 3 more tanks, and these are just the big square tanks. I mean, a lot of people, I'm noticing right now when they're talking about concrete or thinking about the eggs, which are gorgeous and certainly I can see working well for white wine. I mean, I haven't used them and I don't make very good whites, but
I've
I
come
can
to
see
think eggs are decorative, that the eggs look beautiful in a winery when you have the wine tour.
yeah, I think that. I think with whites, they also help circulate maybe stuff if you leave some lees on there. I think with reds, I don't really see any great benefit to the egg. So these, what I have are just big square tanks that we got colored black. I mean, darkly colored, so that way grape juice doesn't stain them particularly. And uh, they they are very, very efficient. They work very well. One of the things that dawned on me, so there's another great advantage to concrete that people don't think about really, but it does end up saving you money ultimately over time. Because barrels, the cost of barrels are pretty high. I mean, so a tank is about $16,000 is what we paid for the 3 tanks, 16,000 each. But you're going to be able to use those tanks for 40, 50 years. When you end up putting wine into oak, a new barrel is $1,000, $1,100 right now. So without introducing any new oak on there, concrete helps quite a bit there. Concrete also, interestingly enough, if the whole facility was done that way, you would not need any temperature control, any humidity control in the building. So you could do an entire building set up as a winery with concrete and Pinot Noir and would not need any of that. The other thing that I've noticed about it is that the wine does not particularly improve after, say, March, April kind of time period. So it's an earlier bottling at some point in time. There's not much that you're getting out of that. So you're absorbing less seller cost onto your cost of goods. This is getting really geeky about COGS here, but
Good.
it does actually help save you money in that regard too.
That's interesting. Why do you think it is that wines that are fermented in other vessels continue to improve in March and April?
So I don't really find that things that in stainless do that to some extent. I do think in oak they do, and it's an integration of oak flavor to some extent, and the amount of oak to the amount of oak to the wine ratio type thing, and it's getting certain amount of flavors. I mean, one of the things I have found is that with certain cooperage houses, when you're aging in barrel after, I mean, right off the bat, sometimes it tastes like, particularly new oak, it tastes like you over oak the wine. It's like, oh my gosh, the wood is very strong. It just, it's an analogy that is flawed in some ways, but it's kind of like you moving into a new home. You know, you can't find anything. You don't know where things are. The wine hasn't found itself. The environment's having a big impact on what's in the environment at that time. After a while, after the wine is in oak for a while, it tends to integrate itself better into the wine. And particularly once it goes through malolactic in the barrel, I don't find in concrete after a certain period of time that you're really gaining that much more in doing it. What you will find is that as it continues to age, the pH will continue to go up. So you do have to really watch that. And if you want to keep some liveliness and some acidity to the wine, you've got to keep an eye on that pH level.
Bottle it.
What?
You've got to bottle it then.
You got to bottle it, exactly. You either got to make an acid addition or you got to bottle it, one of the two.
Interesting. But now when we talk about developing over time, in the bottle, I mean, there are some really top Bordeaux producers that make wine in concrete. So presumably wine's going to continue to evolve in the bottle once it's in there.
Correct. So the people that I know in Bordeaux, and you've been over there much more than I have, the people that I know of in Bordeaux, while they ferment in concrete, I don't know of many people that are keeping it in the concrete for 2 years without going to oak. I mean, are there some?
Not that I know of. No, they ferment in concrete, but you know, it's Bordeaux. They want to have a little bit of oak impact on it,
or a lot of oak impact, depending on the producer. Yes. I think that's a huge difference. I think there is a big difference between fermenting in concrete, which has been, as you said, the norm in some places, older places for a long time, is kind of in again in so many places right now. It is, but then aging reds, aging whites in concrete, I see a lot more. You see that happening. You see aging of whites in lots of different vessels more frequently, be it amphora. I mean, they're just things that you will see people aging white wines in a way that you don't see people aging reds in inert vessels very often.
Well, it's true that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, skin contact whites and things like that. And so much of it is a return to the winemaking of 100 years ago, like concrete itself, skin fermenting whites, non-temperature controlled white fermentations. You know, we're going back to these wines that not our grandparents, but maybe our great-grandparents would have drunk.
Yep. Yeah, I've read a couple of books about winemaking, say thousands of years ago, and I don't know that we necessarily want to go back to those days. They were throwing fruit into the vats, and if the fruit sank, the fermentation was done because they had no way to measure it. So if the fruit was like still at the top of the tank, that's because CO2 was still being given off, and so the fruit would float still, or it would remain at the top. But once the fruit started to sink, that's when they recognized that fermentation was finished. There were a lot of old techniques that, you know, let's go back 100 years. I'm not sure we should go back 2,000 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, most of those wines from 2,000 years ago must have just been nasty because they weren't using cork closures. I believe that's a much more recent.
Yeah.
So, you know, they would ship a barrel of wine somewhere and then you would tap the barrel and maybe it was delicious when you first tapped the barrel, but there's really no way to reseal it. So within 2 or 3 days, you know, and there was no refrigeration. Nobody had refrigerators. So that people must have just drank nasty wine all the time.
Yeah, there was a book, Jefferson and Wine, that talked about that because Jefferson, obviously, when he was living in Paris, was quite the wine aficionado, and he would go and bring wine, I mean, barrels back up to Paris, you know, horse and carriage kind of thing, and bring them up. He ultimately ended up pushing for wines to be bottled at the winery and bring them back up that way because he found that they were better off, and winemakers have cursed him ever since because bottling's a pain in the ass and we don't like it. He might be our favorite president because of Louisiana Purchase, but in other ways, not so much. So,
well, he thought the Union was only going to last 50 years, and in a sense, because he was right because of the Civil War. But yeah. So let's talk about Jackson Family Wine. So you had been the founding winemaker at Siduri, but you're just on the board at Siduri still?
So this year was my last year as winemaker, 2019. We hired a new guy named Matt Rivlett. Matt has been at Sojourn Winery. He's been at William Sellium, Costa Brown, a couple of other non-Pinot producers, but he's got quite the background. And Matt has become an incredibly good friend of mine too, which is fantastic. We got tickets from one of our growers to I got tickets to the Niners Seahawks game this past year. Ooh. And you would think after all the harvest time that I spent with Matt, he's the guy I wouldn't want to spend any more time with, but he's the one that I invited to the game and we went down there and hung out. So he's that good a friend. So Matt and I this past year worked together on the harvest and have just finished up all the blending of the 2019 Siduris. We still haven't finished the Oregon stuff because we're a little limited in our ability to get up to Oregon right now. But we finished all the California blending right now. So my contract then ends at the end of June, and I won't be the Siduri winemaker anymore. But Jackson Family Winery has asked me to stay on in a position of the loosely termed Pinot Noir advocate, where I can come up with different creative ideas, different things like the concrete Pinot Noir, like, you know, Root and Rubble, like other brands, other ideas, other things, look at different plantings, deal with different people in the media or different sales ideas, but all revolving around Pinot Noir. Jackson's got a large Pinot Noir portfolio from Pinner Ash and Willa Kinsey up in Oregon, Grand Moraine, places like that, down to Hartford Court and Siduri, and then down to Brewer Clifton and Cambria and places like that. Jackson kind of covers the West Coast. So my ability to kind of jump in each of these areas and assist. They've got all of these places have winemakers. It's not like they need me from a winemaking point of view, but sometimes I can see efficiency. Sometimes I can do things to help them out, either marketing wise, sales wise, something like that. That's going to be my role going forward, and then making Root and Rubble as well, and whatever else comes my way. So,
if you were still making Siduri this year, we'd be having a conversation now about. Now, you've always made these single vineyard wines from up and down the West Coast. I don't know how anybody's going to be able to do that this year, unless the travel restrictions are loosened.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a real challenge, and it's something that I am concerned about, and we'll see how long this goes on. I guess the question is going to be, where do you stay? What do you do? In all honesty, I mean, I would always drive up and down the coast. I would fly up to Oregon, so that would be more challenging. Going down to the Central Coast, I would drive down. So being in your car by yourself, you're pretty well socially isolated in some ways. You could do that. You could go out and sample in the vineyards on your own and then talk to the grower or call the grower and say, I want to pick this section this day or that section that day. The question would be, where do you stay when you're down there? I mean, do you camp? What are your opportunities to do that? And then Oregon would be much more challenging right now. I think we were very lucky, personally. Other people I know, I feel sorry for them, that we had already done our bottling in January before all of this came on, because bottling is difficult, and trying to keep people 6 feet away from each other on a bottling line. I mean, you've seen enough bottling at times. That's incredibly, incredibly difficult. So we were very fortunate that bottling that had been completed, but for wineries who didn't get that done, that's a real challenge right now.
I often tell people that one of the most impressive things I've ever seen in wine was I went to Fred Franzia's bottling operation for Two Buck Chuck, and oh my God, wow, the bottles going by faster than the eye could process. It was incredible.
Yeah, the best bottling days are boring bottling days where things just run, like you said, like clockwork, and they go, and you hear this clink, 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 clink all the time. I mean, because bottles are hitting one another and all of that. That's perfect. When you are like, maybe I run back to my office and we're bottling and I hear all of a sudden things go silent. Ooh, that's a bad sign, because something went bad on the line then and it stopped.
Mm. Now tell me about Clarice. This is your personal project. Tell me about what you're doing with that.
Sure. So I've got a couple of different personal projects going on right now. Clarice is something that I started in 2017. It is from the Santa Lucia Highlands, the Gary's Vineyard and Rosella's Vineyards, places I've worked with really since the very first crop at those vineyards. But I wanted to do something different here with Pinot Noir. With Pinot, most everybody I know picks each section or each clone when they are perfectly ripe. They look at it and we'll pick the Pommard clone on this day, and we'll pick the 777 10 days later, and then they turn around and they bring them into the winery, they make individual wines, and then they blend them together as a Rosella's Vineyard Pinot Noir, for instance. I decided to go through and take two disparate sections at the Gary's Vineyard and two disparate sections at the Rosella's Vineyard and pick them, sample them together and pick them together as if they were one section, even though they usually ripen 10 days to 2 weeks apart. So that means some of the fruit in there is more ripe and some of the fruit is less ripe. But I'm hoping that they make something more interesting and more harmonious than picking each section when it is absolutely perfect. It's something that my grandmother, Clarice, used to tell me. She taught me to cook in a crock pot. She was born in 1896. But she used to cook for my grandfather in just a large pot. He was a farmer, and she never knew for sure when he was going to come home. It was going to be around sunset, but she wasn't completely sure when. And she said, if you put the meat, the potatoes, the carrots, the broth, and all the seasoning in and cooked them for many hours, they all melted together and tasted somewhat similar. If you added spice at the end, it really stood out. So I'm trying to do a very purposeful field blend, trying to make wine in a large stainless steel crock pot in some ways and have these different sections and pick them together and make it together in that way. The other thing I'm doing is a lot more whole cluster than I've done in stuff from the Santa Lucia Highlands before. So like the 2018 vintage, I'm about 80% whole cluster, which is quite a lot. And I'm also picking earlier, which is interesting for me because, over the years, I definitely have been thought of as a proponent of picking riper, given some of the things that have gone on. But I'm picking early enough here that I've been fortunate. I haven't had to make any additions to the wines thus far. So no acid add, no anything. I mean, other than sulfur, that's all that I'm doing with the wine.
That's interesting. And this is another thing that goes back 100 years because people didn't used to have crews come in multiple days or the span of weeks. They would make a decision and let's just go pick the vineyard and put everything in the vat and ferment it together.
Correct. That's something that was very common. Also, back then, though, you would have field blends, and you still have field blends, but right now in California, our field blends tend to be Zinfandel or things like that. You don't really have much in the way of Pinot Noir field blends. I'm kind of doing a purposeful field blend in this case. So it's interesting, and I've been very happy so far with that, creating a little more harmony in the wines and making a very different wine than I make with Siduri. Again, it's more structured, more backbone, more in need of age. I'm kind of doing the opposite of what you're supposed to do. You know, as I get older, I'm supposed to make wines. I'm not supposed to make wines that need to sell a cellar. I'm supposed to make wines that I can drink earlier in my life in case tomorrow never comes. But here I'm making wines that I really think need some time in bottle, which is for California Pinot, something that we kind of got away from there for a while.
Interesting. I mean, that excites me to hear, and I haven't tried the Clarice blends yet. But that excites me to hear, because one of the things that bothers me a little bit about some wineries is, and this is definitely something that happens in Napa, is that, you know, you start picking individual berries at the perfect level of ripeness and throwing out any imperfections, and you make this wine and it's perfect. You know, every row of the vineyard picked individually at its perfect time, and you make this wine and it's perfect, but it's just not as interesting.
I agree. And that's something, I think it makes some sense when vineyards are very young. When vineyards are very young, Tom Rocchioli years ago told me that when vineyard is young, you take the fruit riper than you normally would, because what you can't get in complexity, I'm sorry, it just doesn't exist sometimes. What you can't get in complexity, you make up for in just pure fruit effusiveness. And that made some sense to me. Now that I've got experience with these vineyards, they're 20 years old. These are places that I think we don't need to do that anymore, and that we can pursue kind of a different direction with the vineyards.
Cool. All right. Well, this is very interesting. I will look forward to trying the Clarice. I haven't had.
I will send you some down. We can make that happen. As long as I can get to the UPS place right around the corner, and you can get to your front door to get some, I'll send you some. So
fantastic. Well, Adam, thanks for joining me today. I always have interesting conversations with you, and so I'm not surprised that this was an interesting conversation.
I enjoyed it. I appreciate it very much. Thank you, Blake.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
Take care.